Hi, everyone. Great to be here today with GMAT Club. I'm Kate Richardson. I'm a senior consultant with MBA Mission. Welcome to today's session on MBA interview do's and don'ts. So we're going to dive right into those do's and don'ts very quickly. Before we do that, I just want to mention that you're welcome to put questions in the comments field. I'll probably wait until the very end to handle those questions, but you can go ahead and put them in there as we go through the content, okay? All right. So if you're here today, you're probably quite nervous about MBA interviews. I know it feels like you've spent months and months, perfecting your MBA applications, working on your testing, getting everything all set and submitted. And then it all comes down to this, 30-minute conversation, oftentimes with a stranger. So there's a lot of pressure on the interviews. I'm here to help you and help you plan out how to prepare for interviews in a very short time frame. So I want to go ahead and start with these do's and don'ts here. There are a few obvious do's and don'ts I actually didn't even include here. Things like, don't show up late for an interview. I hope that's a given. But I want to focus in on a few things that I think will really help with your preparation at this point. Okay. So the first do is to prepare. You for sure want to prepare for this. Like I said, this is an important moment in your MBA application process. Admissions committees are looking at this interview to judge your fit with the program. And we'll talk a little bit more later about how admissions committees are using the interview and what they're looking for. But this is very important. So you definitely do want to prepare, and we'll talk about ways that you can prepare in a very short time frame today. But you should remember that a lot of the preparation you've already done. If you've submitted applications, you've hopefully already done a lot of thinking about your background and your goals and what makes you unique and who you are. So hopefully some of that preparation is things that you've already done. On the other hand, you'll see the don't here is to not have overly scripted responses. You'll hear me say that a lot today. We really want you to be prepared and polished going into these interviews and have a clear idea of what your story is and what you want to say. But nobody wants to interview with a robot, right? So we all want to feel like we're interviewing with a real person. And so you don't want to have answers that seem really scripted that you've planned out ahead of time. That also helps to prepare for unexpected questions, right? You may not know everything that you'll be asked, but if you can prepare for the most common questions and then have some examples ready that you can use for different types of questions, that will set you up much better to respond in a very genuine way. The second do and don't here, you'll see is to definitely show enthusiasm. And remember that admissions committees are looking to judge how excited you are about the program through these interviews. So you want to show that passion and enthusiasm for the school in particular. Smiling can go a long way in the interviews. I do a lot of mock interviews where candidates seem very stoic and it's not that we aren't judging them for being nervous. That's totally normal. But if you don't seem excited to be there, the admissions committee or the interviewer, might wonder how excited you are about that program. On the flip side, however, sometimes we see candidates who are over enthusiastic. So they may go a little too far. They may talk too much. They may talk too fast. They may use hand gestures very aggressively. And so you do want to watch out for those sorts of things because they can be distracting to your interviewer. A good way to combat this is to do some practice. So either record yourself or do a mock interview with a friend or a colleague and get their feedback on those very things. What was my pacing like? And, were my answers appropriate lengths, things like that. As far as this question around how much should you be talking, right? Keep in mind that most interviews are 30 to 45 minutes. And most of those interviews are going to cover around, 10 or so questions, and it varies by school. So you're looking at roughly, 2 to 4 minutes per response. So you shouldn't be going into 5+ minute monologues on any of these questions. They should be fairly succinct answers. But if someone is only responding in 1 minute, that might make me think that maybe they're not fully answering the question or giving a complete example. So there's a balance that you got to strike there somewhere in the middle. Okay. Another important do for MBA interviews is to listen carefully and answer the question. I know this seems simple, but a lot of times when candidates come into interviews, they have an idea in mind of what the school is going to ask them. They might have some stories prepared that they want to use, and they kind of force those stories into the question without actually listening to what the interviewer is asking. So the interviewer might ask you, tell me about a time that you failed. And if the candidate doesn't really answer that question, they might use a story of a time, when they faced a challenge, right? Not really a failure, but a challenge. That's not going to quite answer the question. So really make sure in the interview that you're pausing to take in the question, that you're listening. And even if you're not clear on the question, it's okay to pause and ask a clarifying question, or ask if it's okay to use a, community-based example instead of a professional one. If you're not really clear on what the interviewer is asking you, then it can never really hurt to clarify that. Okay. Also related to that is that you definitely don't want to ignore weaknesses or challenges. So I just talked about an example question of tell me about a time you faced a challenge. And that's a very common question. So is a question around tell me a weakness that you have, or tell me some constructive feedback that you've received. And those can be kind of hard topics to talk about, right? Because you're opening yourself up to the interviewer, you're talking about difficult topics, but that's what they're looking for. They're looking to see how you've responded to difficult situations. They're looking to see how self-aware you are. They're looking to see how you learn and grow from those difficult situations. So please be honest with those questions and don't skirt around them, because that's what the interviewers are really looking to see through those challenging questions. Okay. One of the categories of questions that we'll talk about later are behavioral questions. And these are the typical questions where it's, tell me about a time you did something. Tell me about a time you led something. And for those questions especially, you want to make sure you're using very specific examples or anecdotes. You don't want to have generic responses to those questions. You really want to be telling a story with those responses. And so a good tip here is to use something like the STAR format, which is situation, task, action, result. You could also use a framework of challenge, action, results, something logical that allows you to tell that specific anecdote or story in a very organized fashion. And many interviewers will even be looking for that. When they're taking notes, they might write down the STAR format and be looking for those very same components. So you really want to get into specifics. In particular, I would say with MBA interviews that you want to fairly quickly cover the setup, the S and the T part, let's say, so that you can dive right into the actions of what you actually did in response to that situation. That's really kind of the meat of the answer that they're looking for. And then the results are super important. So again, interviewers are looking for self-awareness and impact. So not only do they want to see that your actions had an impact, had a positive result, but they also want you to take a minute to reflect and explain what you learned from a situation or how it helped you later on. So definitely do not neglect that last part of the example. A lot of times people rush through that. You want to make sure that you're covering that. As you're going through those examples, however, you'll see the don't here is to don't use too much technical jargon or industry lingo. So it's likely that a lot of you are, have examples that are very specific to your role, your function, your line of work. And your interviewer may not have that same background as you. They could be a student who came from a very different background. It could be an admissions officer who's really only worked in higher ed. So you really need to make those anecdotes easy to understand to any audience. Okay, so definitely be cautious of that technical jargon. It can't hurt to just explain concepts if you're worried about that. Just explain them quickly up front and then dive into the example. Okay. After you've gotten through most of the interview, so usually about 30 minutes, like I said, most interviewers will open it up for questions for you. They'll say, what questions do you have for me? That is your chance to not just ask good questions, but show your interest in the school, right? You want to show that you've done a little bit of research, that maybe you've talked to people or you've visited campus or you've attended events and you've learned some things about the school that you're curious about and you want to know more about. Or if it's a student, you might just want to know more about their experience at the school. So you want to have, I would say, between 3 to 5 thoughtful questions thought of ahead of time for your interviewer. Usually you'll only have time to ask about 3, but it can't hurt to have some extras in mind. And you want to tailor those questions to your interviewer. So with some schools, you know who you're interviewing with ahead of time, and some you don't. So there is that challenge that if you don't know who your interviewer is, you may have to prepare different angles on your questions in case it's an admissions officer or maybe it's a student. So you want to have different variations on those questions. But if you know your interviewer in advance, let's say you find out the day before that it's a second-year student, why not look them up on LinkedIn? Find out a little bit about them. You don't want to spend hours Googling them and learning all about their backgrounds. But check their LinkedIn, maybe see if you can find anything about their pre-MBA career or what they're focusing on at that school or clubs they're involved in. And I think that's totally a good strategy to then prepare some questions that are tailored to that interviewer ahead of time. So put some time into those questions, and then just don't ask very basic questions. And by basic questions, I mean things that you could easily look up online. Things like what is the class size like? What are the required courses in the first year? Kind of those factual questions. You want to take your questions to the next level. So you might say, I know that these courses are required. What was your favorite part of the required curriculum in the first year? That would be a good way to make a question next level. Okay. Personally, I also don't like when questions are too negative. So I used to do interviews for Chicago Booth. I probably should have mentioned I did my MBA at Chicago Booth. I did on-campus interviews as a student there. And then as an alum, I did interviews as well too, off campus. And I never liked when people asked me, tell me what you didn't like about Booth, or tell me what you think Booth could do better. It just felt like, we're here to talk about all the positive things about the school. I'm here to represent my school and find a good fit with you and the program. And I never liked when those questions were too negative. So I would encourage you to keep your questions more positive. Okay. Our last do and don't here has to do with kind of the interview format. So there are many interviews that are going to be virtual. Certainly that's very common now to have virtual interviews, usually using Zoom or some other platform. But many schools are doing in-person interviews as well, whether that is you travel to campus and you interview on campus, or maybe you connect with an alum in your local area and you meet in person to do the interview. So yeah, there are some variations based on that style of interview. But my advice here is to treat all the interviews the same, right? Whether it's a virtual interview, whether it's an interview in a coffee shop, whether it's an on-campus interview in the admissions committee member's office, you want to be just as professional in all of those settings. You want to treat it with the same seriousness. You want to look the part. So even if you're at home, like I am today, you still want to dress up. You want to wear a suit. You should, minimize distractions. Be really focused on the interview and treat it just the same as you would an in-person interview. I also believe that you should not be relying on notes for these interviews. So, especially with virtual interviews, I think the temptation is there to have some notes up on your screen or maybe have a few sticky notes nearby with key points. And I think if that makes you feel more comfortable to have a couple of key things maybe jotted down somewhere, that's fine. But you definitely don't want to be using an outline or any sort of script or detailed notes. If you have more than like a few lines of notes, you've definitely got too many. It's just not going to come across as a genuine conversation, like I talked about earlier. And it's very obvious as an interviewer if somebody is relying too much on notes. Now, what if you're in person? Is it okay to have notes? I usually think no. It's pretty obvious, right? You're going to have the notes in front of you, so the interviewer would obviously see that. You could have your resume in front of you if that helps you. Again, I don't think you need to. You should know that really well. But if it helps you feel more comfortable to have your resume, that's fine. Your interviewer probably has it too. And otherwise, I wouldn't use notes at all for these interviews. Okay. So those are our do's and don'ts. I'm going to go into some more background on what the purpose of interviews are next. And I appreciate all of you joining and saying hello from Mexico and India and all places. So thanks so much for joining us here today. We've got a lot more tips to go through as well. And just a reminder, if you have questions, you're welcome to put them in the comments and then I'll cover them all at the end. Okay. So we talked about some do's and don'ts. But why are you here? Why are you interviewing with business school? What are the objectives of the MBA interview? Like I said, the interview usually comes later in the process after you've submitted your application. And with some schools, they have an invitation process. We can talk more about that later. Other schools have open interviews. But no matter what, the purpose of the interview is there's kind of multiple purposes of the interview. So the first is this idea of fit. So the school wants to see how interested you are in them, and they want to see how well you fit into their program. So kind of that give and take, right? Will you bring some things to contribute to the school, and will you also be able to take advantage of what the school can offer you? So they're judging that fit, seeing how interested you are in the program. And that's why it's really important to speak with passion and research the program ahead of time so that you can demonstrate that enthusiasm about the school. A big component of that is your goals, right? So in the interview, they're looking to understand why you're here. Why do you want an MBA? Why are you so confident that this is the right next step for you? And where do you see your career going after the MBA? Now, likely you've written about this already in your applications, probably several times. So you should know this. You should have this story down. And if your interview is one that is a comprehensive interview where they have read your whole application, they may not really even ask you much about your goals, or they may ask some follow-up questions to understand more about your motivations, or they may ask for backup plans for your goals if your original plan doesn't work out. So they may go into that detail. But for most interviews that are resume-based interviews where your interviewer hasn't seen your whole application file, that means they haven't seen your goals, right? Because those shouldn't be on your resume. So this is your chance to explain, both in the short term, so immediately after your MBA, and then in the longer term, 5 to 10 years after the MBA, what is your best guess right now of what you would be doing? Of course, that can change and they understand that, but they want to know that you've gone through that reflection of saying, here's a realistic path for me. Here's how it connects to my background. And here's where I see that taking me in the future. So this is a really big component of a lot of MBA interviews. The third objective is to test your communication skills, right? So you've submitted your applications. They can see your stats and your GPA and your test scores and how well you write essays. But they haven't really heard from you yet, unless they do video questions, but that's a separate topic. So they haven't heard much from you yet. They want to see how well you communicate. How well do you share your ideas? And a lot of this has to do with the business school environment. They want to know that you're going to do well in the classroom. If you're asked to participate in discussions, they want to know how well you'll do in on-campus recruiting during interview time. So this is a chance to show them those communication skills. They're not expecting perfection, but they want to see how well you communicate in this type of environment. The fourth objective, I would say, is kind of on the interpersonal angle. So they want to see how you build rapport with others. And sometimes you hear of this called like the airport test of like, if you're stranded in an airport with this person, would you want to talk more with them? And I think that's a good thing to think about, is that you just want to show that, you'd be a good person to have on a team project, that you can relate well to different individuals, and that you can quickly build rapport. Like I said, these interviews are 30 to 45 minutes. You've got to be able to do that very quickly. And then the last objective is to learn more about you. So this is especially important if an interview is comprehensive and they have read your entire application file. They're looking to add more layers to that, understand more about your motivations for things. But even with resume-based interviews, I still think they're looking to get to know you better, right? And, they're not looking to quiz you on technical concepts. They're not going to be doing, there is one school out there that does a mini case as part of their interview, but most schools don't do that type of interview. Majority of the questions are going to be about you and just getting to know you better. Okay. All right, so now that we have a good understanding of what interviewers are looking for and some of the do's and don'ts, I want to talk a little bit about how I would suggest preparing for your MBA interviews. And recognizing that the timeline is pretty quick, right? So you often have about 2 weeks from when you're notified of an interview until the interview happens. I'm actually starting to see that be even faster. I've had some applicants recently, have interviews the next week. So sometimes it can happen very fast. And so you want to have a plan in mind for how you're going to prepare for those interviews. And so let's say it starts with you receiving the invitation to interview. This usually happens about 4 weeks after deadlines, although we're starting to see some schools like Yale just started doing invitations this week. So, it's usually a few weeks after you submit, they'll start sending out invitations. And I would encourage you, if you do receive an invitation, to book your interview quickly, because sometimes spots can fill up. So you want to go ahead and get that scheduled quickly. I should note that this is different for schools that have applicant-initiated interviews. So a program like Darden, where they allow their early action applicants to go ahead and schedule an interview on their own. You're not necessarily waiting for an invitation to book that interview. So that is different. And then There's also a couple schools, Kellogg comes to mind, where they strive to pretty much interview everyone. So you're not so much as waiting for an invitation from Kellogg, you're really waiting for a match to be, matched with an interview. But for most schools, there's a process of shortlisting that happens where they, send out invitations based on an initial read of your file. It's a good sign when you get these invitations. It means that they like something about your application and they want to learn more. Okay. So what I would do as first steps for interview preparation would be to gather your thoughts on some of the most common questions. So there's just some given questions around why do you want an MBA and what are your career goals that are going to show up in nearly every MBA interview. And you can start by gathering your thoughts for those questions. You honestly could even start this before you even receive the invitation, because like I said, you've done a lot of this work and reflection already. What I didn't put here is script out your thoughts or, write down your thoughts in a long document. You shouldn't be, this isn't a writing exercise, right? So this is about gathering your thoughts, maybe just looking at common questions, jotting down a few bullet points, maybe just saying things out loud. So gather your thoughts on those most common questions and then practice them out loud, right? So whether that is just talking to yourself in front of the computer, maybe recording yourself in front of the mirror, whatever works well for you. Again, this is not a writing exercise, so you want to start early on in practicing saying these things and vocalizing them so that they don't sound like exactly how you wrote them in your essays. They sound like a real human explaining, what their career goals are. That practicing out loud will also help you get used to the timing, right? So like I said, you want to be aiming for, 2 to 3 minutes roughly per response. So you can start to judge whether you're really far off from that number. Okay. The third step that you definitely want to do after you receive the interview invitation is to do more school-specific prep. So every school has their own style of questions, most common questions that pop up at different schools based on, what their values or their guiding principles are or other criteria that are really important to them. So since this step is school specific, I wouldn't say you need to do this ahead of time. This can wait until you receive that invitation. But hopefully you have done some of this research already in preparing your application. So you may be able to go back to notes that you had already. Like I said, you'll want to go on the school's website and learn a little bit more about, what their criteria are, what their values are, what their mission statement is. Kind of have that in mind as you're preparing so that you know what they're looking for. And then, you can find on GMAT Club or our MBA Mission interview guides, which we'll have the links for in the notes. You'll find a list of most commonly asked questions from each school. And so that's a great way to start doing more school-specific preparation. Again, look at those questions, gather your thoughts, start practicing them out loud. So do those same steps. Don't script out your answers, just gather your thoughts. Okay? Once you're at a place where you've done that school-specific preparation, you know some courses that you're interested in and some clubs that you'd get involved in at the school, then I think you're ready to do a mock interview. And I would recommend at least one, maybe 2 or 3, depending on how well the first one goes. But a mock interview really gives you the chance to bring it all together, see what a common interview flow is like, prepare for some unexpected follow-up questions too. So those mock interviews are a really critical stage, I think. You can do that with a friend, a colleague. We offer them, of course. So there's lots of options for how you actually do those mock interviews. But I do think that that's important and a good way to get feedback on how you come across to someone else. Okay. I usually recommend doing mock interviews about a week before the real interview. So that's about the stage you'd be at here, would be about a week out. If it's a few days, that's fine, but I would prefer about a full week, so that you have time to tweak things after the mock interview, maybe do another one, maybe do some more research on the school to fill in your gaps. Okay. The other step here, or the next step here, is to make sure you've reviewed whatever your interviewer is seeing. So if it is a resume-based interview, like I said, most schools do resume-based interviews. Make sure you take a few minutes and review that resume again. It may have been a month or more since you perfected it. So go through it, and in particular, make sure that you can speak to the transitions on your resume. So why did you choose this company first? Or why did you change jobs at this point? Why did you choose this major? Or why did you get involved in this activity in college? Make sure you can explain those motivations and transitions on your resume. And also be prepared to explain any bullet in more detail. Usually interviewers don't dig into the details of your resume, but they certainly could, right? They might ask you to explain a project that you worked on. And so you want to be able to add more context to any bullet on your resume. And this will also help you prepare those specific stories and anecdotes to have ready for those behavioral questions. Because if something was an important example or a key accomplishment, it's probably on your resume, and it's okay to use that as one of those examples in the interview. You just want to make sure you're prepared to add more detail to it, of course. Okay. And then for interviews that are comprehensive, that means that the interviewer has seen your entire application file, and they've read all your essays and seen your transcripts and read your recommendations, and they may have even spent several hours reading your application. So some schools that come to mind for doing that approach would be Harvard, of course. MIT also uses a comprehensive approach, and NYU Stern also does as well. So with those schools, you want to actually spend some time going back and reading your whole application and just being prepared to add more detail and context to anything in the application. Sometimes it can also help to have someone else read it. So, maybe a friend, a colleague. It's something I do for our MBA mission clients, is I read through their application for Harvard and I think of other questions that I would have after reading it. And so that could be a good way for you to prepare for different lines of questioning on your application. Okay. I hope you'll pardon me for having the wrong number here, but step 6 here, not 7, would be to prepare those tailored questions for your interviewer. Again, like we talked about earlier, if you do know who your interviewer is, you can really tailor the questions. If you don't, then you want to have questions prepared that could fit with any interviewer. Most of the time, you at least know whether it's a student or an admissions committee member or an alum doing the interview. Schools kind of have their different approaches of which type of interviewer they use. And so you usually at least know that ahead of time. I will say if a school is doing a comprehensive interview, like the ones that I mentioned, Harvard, MIT, NYU, that is for sure going to be an admissions committee member doing the interview, because they've read your entire application. If it's a student interviewer, they're only going to be given your resume. Okay. Last up is to get interview ready. I'm happy to field questions on this later, but of course, this is going to vary if it's a virtual or in-person interview, but you definitely want to look the part and dress nicely, dress in, I would say, professional suit equivalent. This is the time to bring out that suit. This is a pretty important moment in the process. You also want to just familiarize yourself with any technology that you might be using for the interview. If it is going to be on Zoom and you typically use Teams, then I would make sure you set up Zoom ahead of time, maybe do a mock interview on Zoom, so just that you're comfortable with that platform. Make sure you've minimized distractions the day of the interview. Don't have pets around, roommates around, things like that. Really, clear your time on that interview day so that you're able to focus on the interview. Of course, rest up, make sure that you're in a good headspace before the interview. Okay. I hope that helps, gives you some tips on how to prepare. And our next and final slide is actually just to go through some common MBA interview questions. So we talked about how some of this you can actually start to prepare now, even ahead of when you receive an interview invitation, because there are some very common topics that come up on interviews. So the first category of questions I would say is for sure going to be some sort of intro question, which is usually walk me through your resume. Sometimes interviewers will ask this as tell me about yourself. Basically, they're looking for a few minutes of an introduction. They're not looking for your whole life story. They're not looking for 10 minutes on, everything you did from childhood till now. They're looking for a recap of kind of how you got to where you are. And like I said, about 2 to 3 minutes. They're not necessarily looking for you to go through every single thing on your resume, even though they might say that. But you should still plan to cover those key categories on your resume. So in a 2 to 3 minute walkthrough of a resume, I would want someone to talk a little bit about their college background, what they studied, maybe a key activity they participated in university. I'd want them to for sure talk about their professional background, kind of how they got to where they are, maybe the key focus of their current role. I wouldn't want you to go into a lot of detail on every single resume bullet, but give me some high-level talking points on your current role and how you got there. And then usually it's nice to say something more personal, or, whether it's a community activity you're involved in or a hobby that you regularly pursue, or maybe a little bit more about where you're from or where you grew up. So it's nice to have like a well-rounded introduction to yourself. You'll see different approaches out there in terms of how you structure this introductory question. Personally, I prefer a chronological, like college to career type format, but I even know some of my colleagues prefer going backwards, starting where you're at now, back to college. Some people prefer more of like a thematic introduction of like, here's a couple of key highlights that I want to share, and then you go into more detail on those themes. Honestly, I think any of those approaches works. It's really more what's most comfortable and natural for you. So I would encourage you to try it a couple different ways and see what fits you best. This is where that practice is really helpful. And if you're asked, tell me about yourself, a lot of times people wonder, is that different? Should I be saying other things? Not really. That's basically just the same question. They're looking for that 2 to 3 minute summary of who you are and how you got to where you are. One other thing I should point out is that if you're doing an interview where they've read your whole application, they may not even ask you this question. They might not start here. They might go ahead and dive right in to asking you about, why you like their program, or they might ask you something about something you wrote in your application essays. So there are a few schools where you may not get this introductory question. Okay. The next topic or common category of MBA interview questions are related to your goals and your career path and where you see yourself going. We talked a little bit about this already. This is likely content that you've written about, so you should know it well. But here they're looking for short-term goals, long-term goals, Why do you want an MBA? So what what are the gaps from where you are now to those goals? What do you actually want to learn during business school? And then this last word here, why MBA now? That's super important. So when I was doing interviews at Booth, I would write down like, why MBA, why now? I wanted to hear both of those points from every candidate. And so that's really important to show that you're not just confident in this degree, but also that it makes sense for you now. And I would say this is especially important if you're a little bit more experienced or less experienced than is common. So most, applicants have about 4 to 5 years of work experience. So if you're above or below that, I would for sure make sure you're explaining that. Then there's also surely going to be some school-related questions. So again, a big goal of the interview is to understand how you fit in with that school. So they'll ask you, why is our school right for you? They might also ask how you'll contribute, how you'll give back or get involved at the school. And with those questions, you want to be really specific, right? So you want to have a couple of key reasons, let's say, of why the school is a good fit, and then resources at the school that align with those reasons. So it might be a concentration that you want to pursue. It might be specific courses that you're excited about, or a professor that you've heard about that you'd really love to learn from. It could be more about the student culture and community and maybe clubs that the school offers, or events that they regularly host, like a conference that relates exactly to what you want to do in your career. So they want to hear those specifics and what you're excited about. This doesn't mean you have to list off everything the school is known for. This means you need to pick out the things that are most of interest to you and most relate to your goals. They want to see what you're passionate about. Sometimes schools will ask you a tough question here, which is, where else are you applying? And that can feel kind of tough to answer. You're obviously very focused on selling your fit with that school, and it's awkward to talk about other schools. So what I like to advise doing here is to, very quickly mention 1 or 2 other schools, ideally peer schools that, are of similar ranking or competitiveness to the school you're interviewing with. Briefly say what those schools have in common. Let's say they're all, have good reputations for consulting placements. But then quickly come back to the school you're interviewing with and say why you prefer it. Maybe you prefer its location, or you prefer the student, the student culture and the people that you've met from that school. So very quickly pivot back to the school that you're interviewing with and talk about why it's a better fit for you. Okay. And then another category of questions that we see come up a lot, I would call self-reflection questions. So they're looking to see, how well do you know yourself? How well can you articulate what you're good at, and what your gaps are? So strengths and weaknesses, this is a very common interview question. I would have 2 to 3 strengths and 2 to 3 weaknesses prepared, just in case you're asked for multiple ones. And I would, like I said earlier, be honest. Everybody has weaknesses. Everybody has things that they want to get better at. So it is totally okay to be honest. You just want to show how you're working on those weaknesses. Many schools will ask about accomplishments that you're proud of. I would say there's no right or wrong answer to that question. It's really about understanding why that accomplishment makes you really proud. So whether it's, a promotion you got, or somebody you coached getting a promotion, they want to know why that moment made you really proud. And it should be something very, specific moment or anecdote that you're proud of. Another question could be, how would others describe you? They might ask how your coworkers describe you, how your friends describe you even. So you want to have a couple of keywords that the interviewer can jot down, but then also have some details to back that up. If you say that you are a really collaborative person, you want to give me some reason why, or how does that show up, right? So give me some quick backup for that quality. Okay. And then we touched on this a little bit earlier with behavioral questions. These are very common in MBA interviews. Some schools like to ask a lot of these. Some might just ask one or two in an interview. But these are questions that usually go, tell me about a time you did fill in the blank. So that fill in the blank could be, a time you led something, failed, faced a challenge, faced a conflict, worked with a diverse team, promoted diversity. That's a question we've been getting a lot this year and last year. And you'll notice a theme here that a lot of these either have to do with leadership, because that is so important to what they're evaluating you on. They're looking to understand your leadership skills and how you lead. And then a lot of them have to do with challenges. So they may not be the most fun situations to talk about, but they want to see how you responded to those challenges and how you grew from them. Again, with these questions, you want to have a clear structure to your response. That star format works great here, but you have to be conscious of time. You still don't want to be going more than 3 to 4 minutes, even if it is a pretty detailed example. So these are important to practice ahead of time. But then in the moment, make sure that you're listening to the question that you're asked. It may not be, you might have prepared a story for a time that you faced a conflict with a team member. And then in the interview, they ask you, tell me a conflict you faced with a supervisor, right? And so you have to make sure that your example fits that question. And then finally, there's often some closing questions. And I think this is really important. I think a lot of times candidates just want to be done with the interview. And they get to this point and the interviewer might ask, okay, is there anything I missed? Is there anything else you wanted to cover or anything else I should have asked? And there's a very real temptation to just say, nope, I think we're good. I think we covered it, right? Do not pass up this chance. So this is your chance to add something new, leave the interviewer really feeling good about you and your fit with the school. So I would encourage you, first of all, to have like a mental checklist of a few key things that you want to make sure you cover in your interview. Go through those very quickly. If none of them came up, or if one of them didn't come up, then you can cover it here. Let's say you didn't talk at all about some volunteer work you did. This would be a great opportunity to bring that up. If you covered all those points, then it can be a nice chance to just recap why you're really interested in that school, or share something else you learned about the program that really interests you, or just recap why you think you're a good fit or how you would contribute something to the school. So have something to add for that question. And then what questions do you have for me? That is usually how most interviewers will end. And that is your chance to ask those tailored questions of your interviewer. Usually a few questions you get the opportunity to cover there. Okay. So these are the most common questions. Again, I would also encourage you to look up what questions your schools typically ask, because there are some variations based on schools. But if you're prepared for these questions, you're most of the way there. Those are all of the slides that I had to go through. I'm happy to take questions now about anything related to interview prep. I'll pause there and give you a chance to enter your questions. If you don't have any questions, I definitely encourage you to check out some of the links you'll see in the notes here. There's some school-specific interview guides that we at MBA Mission publish. Those have actual questions from past interviewees at different schools. So those are a really great way to prepare. Okay, we've got one good question here around that introductory question. So tell me about yourself versus walk me through your resume. How would you differentiate your answers? I would actually say those should be pretty similar answers. The interviewer is really looking for that just, a few minutes of introductory around who you are and how you got to where you are now. Um, if they specifically say, tell me more about you or your upbringing or where you're from, obviously you want to add more detail about that. So you may want to make it a little bit more personal if it's tell me about yourself. Walk me through your resume might be more focused on education and professional background, but generally I would approach those pretty similarly. Any other questions? All right, we'll give you a few more seconds. If not, we'll wrap up. I'd just like to say good luck. I know these interviews are stressful, but if you do some of those prep steps that we talked about and just reflect back on all that great work you did in your applications, there's no reason why you can't ace this next step of the process. Okay, well, thanks for joining us. Great to be here today, and good luck.